Welcome to Wild Turkey Science, a podcast made possible by Turkeys for Tomorrow. I'm Dr. Marcus Lashley, Professor of Wildlife Ecology at the University of Florida.
And I'm Dr. Will Goolsby, Professor of Wildlife Ecology and Management at Auburn University. We're both lifelong hunters and devoted scientists who are passionate about hunting, managing, and researching wild turkeys.
In this podcast, we'll explore turkey research, speak to the experts in the field, and address the difficult questions related to wild turkey ecology and management.
Our goal
is to serve as your connection to wild turkey science.
So, I saved the best for last, Marcus.
Okay. This is one of my studies.
The effect of habitat on gobbling.
Okay.
All right. So
I like it.
So I think
I'm assuming that habitat is probably related to density, which is influencing gobbling. That's my guess. But go on.
Probably. Yes, probably. So starting out kind of big picture, Pelletier and others up in Wisconsin, they published this paper in 2021, documented that there was, so this wasn't gobbling activity, they were using gobbling to look at occupancy, which is essentially the probability that a site with a certain set of conditions will be occupied by gobblers as indexed by gobbling activity.
Yeah.
So they found that occupancy was greater in areas that had at least a moderate availability of open cover types within a forest-dominated landscape.
Okay, so if you have openings,
yes,
in the woods,
yes,
checks out.
It checks out. I mean, and you think about it, big picture scale, some of the areas that are still doing relatively well compared to others in terms of their turkey densities in the current day are these areas that, because of the land use patterns, oftentimes have a nice little mosaic of forested areas with open areas, like pastures or hay fields or ag crops or things like that.
Yeah.
Okay. Closely related to that, I'm not sure how to pronounce this one. You'll love that. I'm going to go with Grehan, Grehan.
Sounds perfect.
2022. This was a study out of South Carolina. They reported, this is a thesis, it's not in the peer-reviewed literature yet, but they reported that pasture coverage was the strongest predictor of site use by male wild turkeys in spring as indexed by gobbling. However, pastures only represented 7% of the landscape in their study area.
All right. So disproportionately important effect of the open ground.
Yep.
Again, in a heavily forested area, it sounds like.
Yep. And so that brings us to my Alabama work with graduate student Matt Day. And he found that for every 1%, and this is in Alabama, just to reiterate, for every 1% increase in early successional cover across the property, there was a 10% increase in gobbling activity predicted.
Dang. Every 1% increase? Can you kind of give us some bounds? Like, what is the lower end?
Yep.
And the higher end of how much was available?
Yep. So the property with the most gobbling activity in the study had about 15% early succession across the property.
If you would have asked me how much would you need, that's about where I'd be.
Yeah. And then the one with the least, and actually the one with the least was really close to the average, had 7.5% early successional cover. So what is really interesting to me about this number is we just talked about the Grand study in South Carolina. 7% was pasture. Pasture was the most important predictor of gobbling. The Day study that I just talked about, the average and the site that had the least gobbling had about 7.5% early successional cover. And then we think about the University of Tennessee data that we've talked about before, where hens nested, they preferred early successional and shrubland cover, and it was about 7% combined across the landscape.
Yeah. We got to do better.
We got to do better. All right.
I mean, 7%, it sounds like, well, you don't know how far. I mean, let's maybe I should present this in a different way. Obviously, at some point, the landscape becomes too open.
Certainly.
So
you don't have any roost trees.
Right. So eventually you'd become roost limited.
Right.
But at least up to 15%, you continue to increase gobbling, and I would say it's pretty substantive.
Yeah.
For every 1% in increase in open ground. And did you include pasture and early succession?
So this was at the landscape scale. So we looked across the property, just looking at the cover type. So this doesn't tell you anything about what that vegetation is comprised of.
Yeah.
And this is important because that South Carolina study, showed that pastures were important, and you can assume that most of those pastures are dominated by exotic grasses. Most of the openings in our study were probably dominated by exotic grasses too. So it's showing that those areas are still very important to turkeys, but there's some insights, some more insight from Matt's data that can tell us what we might want that vegetation to be comprised of that could make that response potentially even more positive.
Okay. Well, I want to get to that in just a second. So I guess we need data to continue on that spectrum to see where it starts to decline again.
Mm-hmm.
So we know it's increasing when you're on that low end from 7% up to 15%. And then presumably you're probably not at the apex is just by chance.
That's what I would think, yeah.
So we would assume it's probably going to carry a little bit farther, at least. I guess if I was having to put a number on it, I would expect it to get up into the 20s before you started to see a decline again.
I think so.
With as you increase open, you start to decline in gobbling.
I would think so, yeah.
That would be my guess, but I don't really have any strong data to back that. I'm hypothesizing where that threshold might be.
Yeah.
But I think that's important for people to put into context when you're thinking about, how to design your property. We probably need to get at least up into the teens in terms of open ground to maximize gobbling.
Yes.
And it may be even up into the 20s.
Yes.
But I suspect if we got up into the 30s, we'd start to see it go down on the other side. But to reiterate, I don't think that there's data to support that, but that's just kind of what I would expect.
Well, and here's the other thing that's important to keep in mind too, is that property, because I'm familiar with it, the one that had the 15% early successional cover that had the highest gobbling activity. So that 15% early successional cover was true early succession. These are open areas. But that property also had I don't know what the exact percentage was, but it had a significant component that was woodland that was regularly burned in addition to that early succession.
Yeah.
So the woodland
and the result is that the turkeys burn the woods down.
Yes. Yeah, that place, it's insane. It really is insane.
Yeah. Okay. So let's talk about you said you have some data drilled in to compositional.
Yep. So that was looking at the property level, but then we also took some fine scale vegetation measurements around each of our recording units. So like maybe you had 10 recording units on a given property, and we measured vegetation and we associated that with the gobbling activity at that specific recording unit.
Mm-hmm.
So we found that for every 1% increase in forb cover in the understory, gobbling increased 4.3%. And you contrast that with woody plants. So for every 1% increase in woody plants in the understory, gobbling decreased by about 3%.
Okay, so 1% increase in forb cover equates to 4%.
4%, yeah.
4% increase in gobbling.
Yes.
And for every 1% increase in woody plant cover, like tree saplings or whatever, You had a decrease of 3%.
Exactly.
Ugh.
So that tells us something about how we might want to manage our stands. So we went from the property composition scale, talking about
Hmm.
early successional cover, to the stand level scale in terms of how often we might want to disturb that area to shape that understory vegetation.
Did you guys model grass?
We did model grass, and we did not find a strong effect. We were not able to detect a strong effect of grass.
Okay,
Only
that's what
only forbs
uh,
and woody plants.
yeah, that's what I was assuming, but I wanted to make sure. So that definitely is strong. Like
Yeah.
you're you want to manage for openings over at least 15%, maybe a little higher than that, and you want the composition to be forb dominated, and in the woods probably even forb dominated in
Hmm.
the understory, not herbaceous dominated.
Yeah. Can you imagine how giddy I was when those results came out that way? I was like, "Oh my god, gobbling increases with early succession," and then you look at it at the stand level, and forbs are good, and woody plants tend to negatively influence. I don't want to say they're bad.
Yeah.
They tend to negatively influence gobbling activity at the stand scale. That's essentially what we've been preaching,
Yep.
oftentimes on here, but we have data to back it now.
Yep. And the early succession being important isn't related to grass, it's related to forbs.
Important point.
Yeah. That's strong.
Yeah. All right. So this is where this gets really interesting. The individual
We haven't
gobbler.
gotten to the interesting part yet.
So Palmer and others in 1990. So this takes us back to Tallahassee in Mississippi. I told you probably one
Bill
of the
Palmer, right?
yes, this is Bill Palmer's paper.
Yeah,
Um,
he is the director of Tall Timbers,
that's right.
for those that are not aware.
That's right. So okay, Palmer et al. 1990. They believe that call counts were an index of gobbler condition. So they believe that gobblers gobbled more when they were in better condition. And this is how they support this. So they found that there were some years where acorns were limited on their study site, as well as alternative food sources in response to a severe drought. So they had a severe drought, and they thought that food resources were very limited as a result of that, and that was backed by gobbler weights in the harvest. So during that particular year, gobbler weights were below average, compared to pre and post. So they concluded from that, because the call counts went down in that particular year, that population indices based on gobbling activity may falsely indicate population decline after winters with food shortages.
I don't even know where to go with this, but my instinct is to go to where I'm about to.
Okay, go there.
So I hear this a lot. Folks talk about how birds don't gobble as much now.
This is exactly what I was telling you yesterday when we were on the phone, that I didn't want to give it away, but this is where my mind went to.
So I'm now wondering if we're back to habitat problems that are leading to decreases in gobbling because it affects gobbler condition negatively.
Hmm.
I
Yeah,
wonder if that data exists over long term. Like, what are the body weights?
yeah.
How have they trended over time?
I can't remember which one it was, but it was one of the older papers. It may have been one of Bevel Jr.'s papers that I didn't make a note of it, but they said something about the importance of the breast sponge being an
Hmm.
energy reserve, and they speculated that when it was depleted, or when it was lower going into a given spring reproductive season, that birds might gobble less as a result of it because they didn't have the energy. And when you're looking at some of these numbers that I reported in some of these studies that actually looked at individual gobbling activity, I mean, when you're gobbling and you put your whole body into it like a wild turkey does, and you're doing it hundreds and hundreds of times a day, it stands to reason that you're not going to feel like doing that as much when you're, sick and depleted from being on
Hmm.
poor range.
Yeah, and I was also thinking about that. Like, if you have energy reserves, you can do that instead of eating.
Yes.
So you may, like it's sort of that goes with that. They're maybe they don't want to gobble as much because they don't feel as well or whatever, but they also may not be able to gobble as much because they're forced to
Mhm.
eat.
Mhm. Yeah.
That's interesting. I still I wonder about potential confounding issues and
Sure.
things like there's still some need to explore this further because like for example density might be playing a role or so all these other factors that we've been talking about, but that is really curious that the gobbler condition seems to correlate with gobbling activity.
Not many people have talked about it, and that's the only one that I'm aware of that has some anecdotal data to support it. I shouldn't say
Yeah,
anecdotal, but correlational data to support it.
yeah. Well, that's how this kind of work starts, right? Somebody observes something interesting. There's a really interesting correlative relationship, and they have multiple years and mass data and how big the gobblers were
Yeah.
and the gobbling activity. So you know they are correlated,
Right.
and that makes me think that this is something to go after, right? Like
Well,
the
even
design work to do this.
yes, and I mean, even think about my former student Matt's work that we just talked about. Was that association between gobbling activity and early succession that we observed a function of the fact that we're growing more turkeys on areas that have more early succession? Or is it because we're just drawing in turkeys during the breeding season because there's that early succession they can go out in and strut around? Or maybe it's because birds on those sites are in better body condition so they can gobble more. Or maybe it's all three.
Yeah, I was going to say they're not necessarily mutually exclusive.
Yeah.
So that is really curious. So doing things that attract gobblers and lead to them being in better condition and lead to there being more of them are probably all going to be favorable
Yeah.
for your hunting experience and having a sustainable population of turkeys. So I'm thinking about other issues like the land conversion away from upland oak,
Mhm.
things like that. So where you might have this sort of cycle that's happening that's associated with mass, not just from the gobbler's condition, but also from the hen's condition.
Yeah, because we've covered a couple papers on here before that show that, hen body condition coming out of winter can influence timing and clutch size, timing of nesting, and wasn't it?
Yeah.
No, it wasn't clutch size. It was nest success.
Oh my gosh, I just thought of something very interesting. So the gobbler condition is influencing how much they invest in gobbling potentially, and it's influencing when the hens initiate nests, which might influence how much they overlap chronologically. Man, it's getting complex now, but that's really interesting to think about.
Yeah, I mean, we always end up on habitat, don't we?
Well, I
Is
mean,
that
it's
because we're biased, or is that because it is foundational?
yeah. Something that's really curious to me.
I think it's both. We are biased,
Well,
but
it is.
it is foundational.
There's no question that it is in my mind, but there is one curious thing, and there's probably a few folks watching us on YouTube that are screaming at us periodically because it hasn't come up yet. Did you find anything about predators influencing gobbling
Mm-mm.
or predator abundance or
No, no, I did not find anything related to that. I mean, hunting is a form of
Yeah.
predation, obviously, but that's the
Well,
closest
yeah, I
thing.
just meant
That's the closest
the,
thing that we have. I didn't come across anything where they had, you know, uh, gobbling activity as a function of coyote density or something like that.
hmm.
Maybe it exists and I just didn't come across it, but I'd be surprised.
Yeah, that is curious. Normally when we're talking about habitat a lot, folks that are on the predator side of the discussion get irritated about it, and it made me think
Sure,
of it.
sure.
I was just curious if there was anything,
I didn't find
related to
anything.
predators.
No, I didn't.
So, hmm. Well, maybe that needs to be worked on.
So how do you feel about the difficulty of studying gobbling at this point?
Well, it's definitely daunting.
Yeah,
I'm uh, I'm not discouraged though.
right.
I mean, we are developing new technologies that are going to open doors, and you know, we have lots of researchers and lots of places that are taking advantage of these ARUs. I
Mhm.
think we're going to learn a lot about what's influencing gobbling. I hope that folks understand that understanding factors influencing gobbling are important to the populations.
Mhm.
It's not just to appease hunters. I've heard criticism about studying gobbling
Yeah,
instead of like what's causing the decline or something like that.
yeah,
But it's an integral part of how populations are functioning, and it's an important part of understanding what's going on with populations. So I hope that people get that from it.
yeah. I mean, just think about all these gobbling and other factor associations that we've talked about today that lend insight into, turkey ecology and management that we wouldn't have if those studies had never been conducted.
Yeah. Well, and think about it another way. There are some people who can hear, oh, we need to increase the amount of forb dominance so that poults
Yeah,
are successful.
right.
But there's still some people that's not real. They don't care.
Yeah,
I mean, it's not motivating them to
yeah,
change anything.
yeah,
But when they hear, oh, if I increase for every 1%, I increase forb cover, I increase gobbling by 4% or whatever it was, maybe that'll get more forbs on the ground, which is
yeah.
also going to benefit reproduction because that's where poults are going to be more successful.
Mhm.
So you know I think it's good for us to explore different things like this that are motivating. There are different factors about
Yeah,
what's going on with turkey populations that have different degrees of motivation across people, I guess is what
yeah.
I'm getting at.
Yeah, and I mean, I think one of the things that's interesting about the direction this conversation went is probably, I think, some of us, or like maybe you came into it, or some of our listeners came into listening to this episode thinking that it was going to be just kind of like fun, lighthearted, like turkeys, this is the best day to gobble, and here's how you like
Hmm.
game that system to figure out when are the best days. But we got into all these other, I mean, we got into so many different aspects of turkey ecology
Yeah.
that play into it. I mean, it's
Yeah. And the problems with studying it, but also the inferences that could be gained about managing populations that are above and beyond just, how many we should harvest or
right.
when we should harvest them or whatever. So, yeah. And honestly, that was kind of how I started out the conversation was I was assuming that we were going to be, people were going to be taking notes
Yeah.
on when to expect the most gobbling.
Yeah. Which that was in there, but
Yeah.
it's so much more than that.
Yeah. I do appreciate that more now. So that's why I wanted you to do the deep dive because I know you've been working on it. And this is also getting me more prepared because we are going on our third field season now of collecting ARU data, and we have not really dove in
Mhm.
to analyzing the data, but we are going to have some pretty interesting things, like for example, we have true replication not just temporally, but also spatially, of hunted and unhunted populations.
Yeah, that's going to be good.
So we have 6 hunted and unhunted population pairs.
Yeah, I can't
And
wait to
that's
see what
good.
the differences in the magnitude of the peak and the timing
Yeah.
and the duration are between those sites. That's going to be super
Yeah.
interesting and informative.
We also have 2 populations where the hunting season is actually in the early season and the late season for southern Florida,
Hmm.
where we have the chronology of nesting and the chronology of gobbling over 3. It'll be 3 years after this
Yeah,
season
yeah,
on both. So that'll be really interesting.
right.
But we also this year are initiating a larger effort where we will be adding 10 more sites with ARU. So we'll
Yeah,
have over 20 total sites running
yeah,
at the same time. And some of those are hunted, some are not. They're also all up and down the peninsula and across the panhandle of Florida. And we're going to have multiple additional sites of nesting chronology.
I feel like this is one of those old school, wait, there's more commercials. That's a lot. You got a lot
Yeah.
going on.
Well, I'm excited about various things, but that is pretty exciting to have true replication, at a level that maybe we can start to get at some of these questions that are still at large.
Yeah, and that's not to fault, any of the previous research that's been done. A lot of that is constrained by funding availability and personnel and all those
Hmm.
kinds of things. So,
Well, the availability of sites. I mean,
yes,
there's all kinds of things. It takes so much to do these kinds of studies.
it does.
So I'm glad that we have figured out a way here to to increase the level of work than we would have normally been able to accomplish. And
Right.
I'm really hopeful that we're going to see that pattern happen in a lot of places.
Yeah,
We've already seen it to some degree because we now have turkey work going on in so many places.
that's right.
So it's an exciting time for discovery for the wild turkey for sure.
You know what else is exciting?
What's that? Thanksgiving?
I, I got one more fun stat to leave you with. The greatest number of gobbles that we recorded at a single unit on a single day. What would you guess?
I'm gonna go with 1,136.
Oh, that's way too many.
I was really hopeful.
It was 364.
Wow.
364 at a single unit over a 6-hour period. I mean, 80% of that was 30 minutes before sunrise to an hour after.
Yeah.
So they were just burning it down. Could you imagine sitting in that spot?
Golly. 300 gobbles in the morning. That's pretty good. Pretty good day. I love those days.
I would be satisfied. I would be a
Yes.
satisfied hunter.
So that did actually bring up one other thing that we did not discuss. Did you get into any studies that looked at the chronology of gobbling with across the dial period? I mean, I assume the majority of gobbling's happening there in the morning. But
Yeah, there's some of that, and I had some notes on it that I deleted because I didn't think we were going to get into it. But I remember it.
Rookie mistake.
I remember it being like, I think Chamberlain's lab has produced some stuff on it, and Matt Day and Mike collaborated with us on that work with Matt, that he did for
Mm-hmm.
his thesis, and our numbers were real in really close agreement that it's like 75 to 80% of the gobbling in a given day is going to happen 30 minutes before sunrise to an hour after.
Yeah, that sounds about right.
Yeah. So
Okay. Cool, man. That was really, really interesting stuff. I did not realize how complex the amount of dimensions and rabbit holes to go down, all of that. That's
it
really
gave me an
cool.
appreciation for it too.
Honestly, I think some people keep coming back because we keep opening these doors of complexity.
Yeah.
But I know that it's frustrating some people too. 'cause
Yeah,
they're
but
telling us that it is.
I'm sure it is. But one of the things that I hope is that maybe this one is stimulating enough to people to prompt them to write in some questions. Like hopefully it's prompting questions in people's minds that we can base other episodes around, or try to address and dig back into literature and see if there are any answers on it.
Yeah. It's good stuff.
All right, we done?
I think so. Yeah. Everybody, we sure do appreciate you. Thanks for everything, all the support, all the feedback. Keep bringing it to us. Let us know what you want to hear about. We're really thankful, that people have been so engaged and so supportive of this. It's really keeping the fuel in the engine.
Absolutely.
So thanks everybody for that.
Wild Turkey Science is part of the Natural Resources University podcast network and is made possible by Turkeys for Tomorrow, a grassroots organization dedicated to the wild turkey. To learn more about TFT, check out turkeysfortomorrow.org.